everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Planning Pulse. It's me, Sam Batchelor. I'm joined again by Stacey.
Hello, everyone.
We thought that we would talk to you today about an interesting planning appeal decision that we've received recently.
Well, hang on. It's more than interesting, isn't it? Because we spoke about it last episode, Sam. So we already highlighted that it was a test case and it was really groundbreaking. So introduce it properly.
All right. Well, I'll come on to that in a second because we'll otherwise... if we've got time, probably just run over some of the thoughts that we've got about the planning and infrastructure bill that came out this week. But yeah, going back to the appeal decision then. So last time we explained that we had a appeal hearing relating to a condition discharge application, and that application was meant to deal with matters relating to foul drainage for a new development. The bone of contention was the fact that we expected there to be information relating to off-site infrastructure improvements, so improvements to the foul drainage network to improve capacity, and they were absent. We refused the application, ended up at appeal. I thought that maybe in the first instance it'd probably be good to just talk about foul drainage and how both in our careers that's been dealt with before, because I've got a particular view and understanding about how it's been dealt with in the past, but I don't know if you've shared it or how you kind of dealt with it. But
well, I think you're going to say, I mean, it's really interesting actually. I wasn't expecting you to say that, but for me, if I go first, then I can remember when you wouldn't touch a planning decision with a planning condition or an assessment that related to any form of drainage, including surface water, of course. You would simply leave it to the separate consenting regime, which, you know, I can recall when it was solely left to building regulations. But I think the point is that through our careers, I'm a bit longer in the tooth than you, but the requirement to consider, well, broader things within the planning sphere has dramatically increased. Yeah. Is that the point you were going to make?
Well, I thought we were going to get there, but yeah, it was just to kind of maybe go through it chronologically, if that's the right word to use.
My memory
it has changed over time, hasn't it? I mean, I always think of a particular case when I worked at Hastings Borough Council. There was a sewer that was going across a site, had an objection even from Southern Water at that time. You don't get objections nowadays, do you, really, to planning applications from Southern Water, and perhaps maybe refuse the application on that basis. And that didn't go anywhere. I remember at the time it just being allowed on appeal. I mean, the reason I went with the objection at the time from memory, and this is a long time ago now, so maybe it was a bit of a bit foolish to try and talk about this off the cuff, but it seemed insurmountable. You know, it was quite a significant sewer that was crossing the site, served loads of development. It was clearly going to cost an absolute fortune in order to be dealt with. If Southern Water would agree to it anyway, just because was that the best solution in terms of being able to resolve it with a diversion or whatnot. And yeah, kind of had my fingers burned then. It wasn't really anything to do with planning, nothing to see here, kind of get lost. And then I basically considered the matter in that way ever since. Maybe kind of 5 years ago, 10 years ago, I think we started to think about it a little bit more and say that maybe there's something in restricting occupation until such things were resolved. But we've certainly only been thinking about that in the way that we do now for maybe the last couple of years.
It was the full council motion 2022?
Yeah, well, in which case then, can you explain a little bit more about what we were doing as a result of that full council motion?
Well,
and why we got to what we do.
Well, essentially it was to do with concerns in relation to sewage, and sewage appearing in people's homes and gardens and backing up in their toilets and other drains, which is not a new issue. I was talking to Councillor David White about this in light of the Old Orchard appeal decision, and David pointed out that he's been campaigning in relation to this issue for, you know, in excess of 10 years. But the full council motions, and there have been a couple since, so that what we're doing as planning officers has sort of been tweaked each time. But it's to continue processing planning applications, but trying to secure better quality information in order that there's no surprises, and in order that decisions taken on development applications are done so with the best available evidence. Because, a bit like you hint at, it was the full council motions. It was done sort of absent because it was a building regulation matter, or it was a separate consenting regime matter. But because it goes to flooding, and because it goes to pollution, which are matters now front and centre within National Planning Policy Framework and associated guidance, and indeed our own policies in both the core strategy but also the Save 1998 Wealden local plan has got policies in relation to avoiding pollution and mitigating against that. The assessment has come full circle and is incorporated within assessments on planning applications. Now, the primary change following the full council motions was to engage directly with Southern Water, or try to engage differently.
Yeah.
And listeners will probably be aware that Southern Water have actually come to the table and have engaged with us, and we've been we sort of spearheaded a local planning authority stakeholder group involving all planning authorities in the Southern Water catchment area, just over 20 other councils in that group, and those councils and the planning departments in those councils all wrestling with exactly the same issue. And so we'll come back to the appeal in a minute, because we were in disagreement with Southern Water, and we'll explain that in detail in a second. But elsewhere, we have seen a step change with Southern Water, where they have been, responding to applications in a different manner. And that is twofold, really. We've persuaded them to undertake detriment analysis much earlier in the process.
Yeah.
So they would only usually do that post the grant of planning permission, once a developer has a consent and then approaches them to connect into the network. And what we've said is that's too late. It's down the line. We need that upfront so that members of the planning committee can understand if the network has any capacity constraints or if it needs any upgrades. And they've been doing that, but in excess of 50 unit schemes, 50 dwelling schemes, and not below that. But they've also been talking to us about the capacity of their infrastructure. Now, bringing it right back round to the Horam example, this is where it gets a bit interesting, because in relation to the refusal of the condition discharge, their position was consistent. Which, I mean, you might be best to explain this because you did the hearing. But
well, maybe I should pause you there, because I think maybe we should kind of put some flesh to the bones of this.
Okay.
So, what we had was a planning application in Horam.
Yep.
For those that are interested, we'll put the information in the podcast notes. But just for now, the planning application reference was WD 2021-2356 MAO. Now, that was an application for 38 new houses.
Yep.
It actually followed a history of other planning application submissions that weren't quite on the mark. From memory, I think maybe withdrawn, really, never really.
No, it was an appeal, wasn't it? It was allowed at appeal as outline.
This application was allowed at appeal, but
Yeah.
the previous applications, I mean, seemed to be previous proposals at the site.
They were, but let's not go down that rabbit hole.
Fair enough. But yes, this application was refused.
Yeah.
That was a committee decision, I believe, refused on essentially landscape harm. Wasn't a good fit in terms of the number of units in that location. But yeah, went to appeal and was allowed on appeal, the inspector not agreeing with that particular reason for refusal. However, what was interesting about that appeal was there were lots of representations from the local community, the parish council,
Horam Parish Council,
in relation to local flood issues, basically, that were centred around foul drainage and pollution. And the inspector clearly had time for that and considered it to be a sufficient enough issue, such that they imposed a condition that none of us really batted an eyelid to, really. We'd already recommended one as officers when we presented the report for approval to committee, and the inspector has imposed something similar. we nowadays try to make our condition in relation to this issue a bit more explicit, don't we? So not only do we say that we would like foul drainage details, but we also make it very clear that those details should include information about any off-site infrastructure improvements, and also restricting occupation until that had been carried out. This condition was a little bit more basic in its wording. It just asked for foul drainage details, whilst also still restricting occupation until the details that had been approved had been carried out. But
there was a row about that, wasn't there?
Hadn't made it abundantly clear what that meant. We took the view that it clearly related to both, the off-site arrangement of the on-site arrangement of drainage, as well as off-site, what was needed to be done off-site. And that leads us, I suppose, to the essence of the appeal. So go on, over to you then. Kind of doing a bit of to and throwing on the same thing.
Well, I don't know. I go on, but there was sort of 3 parts to it, wasn't there? I think it's 3 parts. And the bits I did, I messed up because there was actually an award of costs, wasn't there? A partial award of costs. Well, I'll come to that in a second.
Do it in order.
So, the primary and substantive issue, and we'll call it number 1, is that Southern Water had repeatedly advised us in writing and in discussions that they had no objection. And that,
although interestingly, at the planning application stage, they had flagged issues.
They had flagged an issue, yeah. But in relation to the condition discharge, which is what was before the most recent planning inspector, Southern Water were adamant. They were absolutely, very firm in their position that they had capacity to accept the foul connection for the 38 homes. Now, this is where it gets interesting. They, at the same time, conceded that during back-to-back storms or periods of heavy rainfall, the sewage system, the foul drainage system, became inundated with surface water. And they said there was a problem when the system was inundated, particularly at the pumping station at the site, which connected over into the Vines Cross wastewater treatment works, which is just around the corner off Laundry Lane, for those that know it, by Mile Green. Anyway, we questioned them on a series of occasions to try and understand and unpack this issue, that on the one hand they were arguing they had capacity, but also conceding that the system had capacity problems, but only linking it to surface water. And one of the things that we were particularly interested in, and in fact we've never had an answer, and this came out in the appeal decision, what we wanted to know was that if the system has been surcharged and full of surface water from heavy rainfall, what happens to the foul? What happens to the sewage element? Does it just get diluted, or is it that issue that is causing the problem in terms of it appearing in people's houses and in their drains and all the rest of it? There are all sorts of unsavoury things that listeners will be able to imagine, and we never got an explanation to that.
No.
We asked them 3 times in writing over a period of months actually before we took the refusal decision.
Yeah.
And interestingly, that position was described in the appeal decision as illogical. The inspector was on our side in relation to that point, that fundamentally that did not make sense. Now, there's a further point to it, which is that the wastewater treatment plan, which Southern Water is required to publish in relation to all of their kit and installations around their network, the one for Vines Cross wastewater treatment works acknowledged that there was a problem in terms of surface water inundation, explained what needed to be done. Indeed, there's a costing of that work, initial costing, but then said something along the words to the effect that they were going to look at it a bit later on in the timeline and they were going to come back to it post 2030.
Yeah.
But meanwhile, there were more and more foul connections into the network, and that was the point that the planning committee, members of the planning committee, were initially unhappy with on the outline, and indeed was accepted by the outline inspector, particularly with local residents and Horam Parish Council's very powerful submissions at the time, and that's the reason for the condition in the first place. So we won the point around capacity.
And just on that, we do understand why we were getting those responses from Southern Water. They were making a distinction between capacity in terms of the foul network being able to deal with foul drainage, but it was specifically the answer about the kind of the surcharging and the ingress of surface water into the system and what that meant in terms of capacity and the function of it that just went unanswered for all of that time. And that's exactly what the inspector was commenting on when they made that comment about it being illogical, that you're adding new development. We know that water's getting in, that's making the situation worse somehow. Needs to be dealt with. And so, I mean, I suppose that neatly brings us to then the conclusion the inspector made about that particular point. You know, we've got a local plan policy that talks about there needing to be adequate infrastructure to serve development.
WCS 7 in the core strategy.
Yep, and the inspector simply linked that lack of infrastructure and insufficient in terms of it clearly is not operating correctly and development will be connected into it, and saying that wasn't adequate, and there's a policy that says it does need to be adequate, and saying that the condition discharge didn't deal with that matter, and so was able to dismiss it on that basis. But
I mean, there's these other points which I'll come on to in a second, and we can be brief because we didn't win them, and in fact we had a partial award of costs. We'll come back to that in a second. But before we go off the point, and there's sort of two further, I guess, points to make. The way the appeal played out, I believe, I don't know what your views are, we haven't actually chatted about this, but was in our favour, and by that I mean it was a grant of planning permission. So it wasn't a refusal of planning permission, it was a grant of planning permission with restrictive conditions that sought to control the delivery of those homes and their occupation, linked to the delivery of infrastructure to sustain those homes, which, as you say, Sam, was hand in glove with policy WCS 7 in the core strategy. I think it probably would have been different as an outright refusal of planning permission, because fundamentally the whole position, because we'd said, well, you know, as a planning authority we're not anti-growth, this growth has been allowed, it's been permitted, when we're simply seeking to control its delivery in accordance with the development plan and the policies that require infrastructure. And I think that was a powerful combination of arguments. The other point is just around how much interest there is in this appeal, and it was something we said before on a previous episode of the Pulse. Lots of other planning departments around and about the entire country have asked us about this. It's a short point but a powerful one. There are lots and lots of examples where other councils have tried to do something similar, and for one reason or another, and it's usually site specific or policy specific, there aren't very many examples where this has been successful, certainly not any of late. So very much groundbreaking, lots of interest, including local press but also national planning press have reached out, haven't they, in terms of doing a sort of spotlight article in relation to I guess how we won it and why and what we were up to. Do we want to go on to the environmental harm point? I mean, we can do, but it was, I think so. It's not covered in glory, really.
No, but it's worth mentioning because I think we should tell all sides of the story. The inspector considered two other main parts as well. One was flood risk, which I don't think we'd really mentioned too significantly. They were bringing that to the table because, you know, drains overtopping, discharging, you know, however you want to describe it, there being overflows, does create a flood incident. And they asked a few questions around the flood risk assessment and how that wasn't flagged up at the time. And so
the original outline.
I mean, I don't particularly want to get into that now, not least because I don't really understand it fully, but they kind of concluded
I don't think the inspector did.
Flood risk not so much of an issue despite flooding was occurring. But yeah, there is this impact on the environment, biodiversity that the inspector didn't agree with us on,
which I think is a really strong point, and I was behind this. It was me, hands up. In fact, actually, I think I'm on public record saying that, but go on.
So
I don't understand it.
There's two things to say. First of all, in the appeal decision on the condition discharge application itself, the essence of the inspector's decision is very much that biodiversity harm or impacts on ecology were flagged by the council, but case not proven. And case not proven because as much as we presented Southern Water's systems plan information, which spoke about the relevant infrastructure that we mentioned, the pumping station, the wastewater treatment works, themselves flagging that there's problems. That there were problems as a result of those pieces of infrastructure failing and ultimately discharging into watercourses that were connected to the natural environment. That in itself wasn't evidence of the harm that the inspector was trying to identify, and I'll come back to what I think he was trying to identify myself in a second. But secondly, we'd also provided information from DEFRA, and that information was about the triple SIs that those watercourses ultimately
in the Cuckmere drainage catchment.
We identified 3 different ones, I think, ultimately from the development site all the way up until it meets the sea. The inspector, in their decision, talks a lot about needing to explain what about the triple SIs was being harmed by the development or by foul drainage, in so much as foul drainage increases chemicals within the water. Phosphates in this particular instance seemed to be something that was being flagged.
He was asking you that, wasn't he?
Yeah, and he asked me that, and there wasn't something that I could identify immediately in the evidence that we presented.
Glad you were there, not me.
that could help explain that. But it's a really interesting point, because then linking that back to the cost decision, because we couldn't identify that linked harm.
He was a partial award.
Yeah, he's saying that was unreasonable. We didn't then provide any information from our own ecologist.
I think that's really wonky, though.
And then also a criticism about not consulting Natural England, that kind of added a cumulative thing in terms of him making a decision about that.
Unreasonable behaviour. Yeah.
I think it's really interesting, and maybe we don't need to discuss it anymore, but I just think it's really interesting in terms of that appeal scenario, because at a planning application stage, I think that having the systems plan and the DEFRA information would have been enough evidence to go to the applicant as assessing the application and say there's
an issue
here. Material evidence here that explains there's an issue. We think that you need to provide some evidence in order to explain the lack of harm, because there's enough to suggest there could be harm. Where in the appeal scenario, with the absence of that information, the inspector has kind of emphasised the onus on us to have done all of that work.
I don't know about that.
Maybe we think that's a little unfair. Unless you want to say anything more about it, we can leave it there if you like.
I was going to say something about the impact risk zones, but it's another thing in of itself, isn't it? It's this sort of online web thing.
Yeah, should we mention that briefly? I mean, for those that aren't familiar, impact risk zones are a GIS tool developed by Natural England.
Online only.
What you do is you go online, you look at your site that you're considering in relation to those zones, and the metadata that sits behind those zones explains what type of development is likely to have a significant impact either on triple SIs or by extension European designated sites as well.
It spits out a response, doesn't it?
It spits out a response such that it dictates, or not dictates, that it suggests that those are the instances in which formal consultation with Natural England would be beneficial. The triple SI impact risk zones in this instance weren't flagging up that development in this location.
So it's only interested in intensive agriculture, and this was the point that we made, that because listeners will remember we said a second ago that the inspector criticised us for not engaging with Natural England early enough. But the impact risk zone is only interested in intensive agricultural operations. So what we argued was that it was unsound because it triggered the problem. Well, you disagree?
I still stand by the point that I made to the inspector, which I remember at the time that I made it, he was completely dismissive of as well, which was trying to explain that the impact risk zones in relation to an issue like this,
it's not nuanced enough.
It's not nuanced enough because we have known issues in our district with much more established and significant habitats, Ashdown Forest being one, Pevensey Levels being the other, where if you use the impact risk zone on the basis that you were completely ignorant to issues in Wealden, so say for example somebody had never processed a planning application in our area, in our team, processing it, they would not. They would not seek mitigation for impacts on the Ashdown Forest, and they would not seek mitigation for impacts on Pevensey Levels, because the impact risk zone will tell you there was no likely significant effect on those from that type of development in that location, and so I think that's a valid point, but it kind of fell on deaf ears.
It wasn't enough for him to join those dots, I don't think.
But we need to think about that. Maybe
everyone needs to think about it, because it's a problem with AI, isn't it? use AI, use these tools, use these online, tools and equipment, but they're not sufficiently nuanced and can basically lead you to an outcome that is wrong and unsound. Yeah. But enough on that. Anyway,
Indeed. But yes, just in summary then, an issue that is affecting development up and down the country, even in the absence of development, sewage discharge, a massive national issue. Been lots about that recently. Government have talked about it, especially since the Labour government came into power, because it was something that was building up at the end of the last government, and then obviously into this new one. And this is just a particular case that's related to it, and it was 50-50 in terms of its outcome, and we're a bit surprised, I suppose, by the decision in some ways, aren't we?
That's so many messages from developers saying, what have you done? Why have you done this?
Yeah. I suppose we should also just finish that we're not ignorant to the consequences. We do understand, that we are partners in trying to deliver development within our area, but equally we are accountable and also involved with working with residents and members as much as we are developers. And this is just one particular issue where there was enough pressure for us to look into this a bit more and fight that particular from that particular angle a bit more. And this is where it's ended up.
Yeah,
whether other authorities follow is up for them.
I think they will.
We'll put all the details of the case so you can see the decision, how it came to. So it might be useful to you in the notes. Planning and infrastructure bill.
Yeah.
So there's been changes galore over the last 6 months, but this is this week's one.
Have you read all of it? It's 197 pages.
Of course I haven't. I've only read the people that kindly write the summary articles about it. I'd
posted about that, saying I was waiting for somebody far more savvy and intelligent to give a précis.
There's been a few, maybe, and they're not. We're not saying they're the better ones, but if there's some that we know that we've looked at, we can
do some links. Yeah, there are some good ones.
I've already just focused on the things that affect our day-to-day work, but it's very broad. It does cover strategic planning policy, infrastructure and other things. But in terms of our world immediately, the things that it includes are a national scheme of delegation.
Hang on, I'm going to jump in.
Okay.
I think you've missed a key thing.
Oh, okay.
And that is blink if you miss it at the top, which is a planning and infrastructure bill specifically to accelerate development. So the context in which this bill has come out is very open and kind of in your face. It's not about unfortunately it's not about saying no. It's very much about saying yes, and because it uses the word accelerate, it's about doing it at speed. But anyway, sorry, go on.
No, so we've had the changes to the NPPF that were to help facilitate that, but this is the government saying, well, that's part one of it, but there are things that we think that we needed to change from a legislative point of view that would help with that too. So yes, okay, fine. First thing then that I picked up on was national scheme of delegation. So this is the government's attempt to dictate from a central government point of view the types of applications that should be brought before planning committees on the basis that they see officer delegation as a way of expediting that development and growth, and that really they're making a distinction in between those types of applications that they're happy to be dealt with at a delegated level versus the ones that need a bit more democratic oversight. We have that as an officer body, don't we, in terms of our discussions that we have with members when they call in applications about whether that's one that really fits that bill anyway. But this is the government's attempt at trying to kind of push that from the top down kind of thing. There's some indication or suggestions from others who are commenting on it about what those thresholds might be.
There's nothing out there, is
there?
there?
I don't know if you've heard any more about that.
No.
But I've seen lots of different kind of thresholds banded about.
It's not set out. It's not in the bill. The bill is just the initial stage for setting this up, and there'll be more detail to come via, I think, either secondary legislation or statutory instrument. But I don't know what that looks like at the moment, and I think it'd probably be speculation to talk about those thresholds. It's funny, isn't it, though, because coincidentally at the same time we are undertaking at the Wealden level work to look at the Constitution, as we do every year as part of a working group, subgroup of audit, finance and governance. So we were already looking at this issue. So we'll see what comes out from the next stage of legislation.
Indeed, that directly relates to the next thing I noted then, which was they also want to influence the size of planning committees themselves. I take that to mean smaller committees, on the basis that ones that are too large, maybe it's that kind of too many cooks kind of angle to it, and it's more likely then to go south in terms of there being a refusal of a development. Obviously there's some kind of discussion and debate to have around that. Again, that is related to our local considerations anyway. With the changes we're making to the constitution, we too are also looking at size of committees when we're reviewing which committees we have. The next part was something we actually mandate ourselves anyway, which was member training. So members can't sit on our planning committees if they haven't undertaken member training. That's interesting because that must mean that not all councils
are doing it.
That.
Which I don't know. I suppose is slightly alarming. Some people might scoff at this, I suppose, where we say we do train our members if they've had and seen a decision which has gone not the way they intended. There might be an accusation that the members need better training or more training. Yeah. But fundamentally, for a very long time,
that about us sometimes.
Yeah, probably. But for a very long time at Wealden, there's been mandatory training, but that will be rolled out now and compulsory as a national matter. And it's interesting that there'll be a requirement for members on planning committees to hold and publish on a register a certificate of completion. So it's
the government's serious about it. That you are accountable in that way. Last thing in terms of our kind of DM world then was just about planning application fees. There'd been suggestion for a while that authorities would be able to kind of set their own fees. That's in there. Also some indication that if authorities aren't using that, or if they've kind of undercooked it or overcooked it, that the government can step in and say, you should be charging your own fees, and we tell you these fees should be, A, B and C, X, Y and Z.
That's a bit weird though, isn't it? If a council, quick cutting to the point, if a local authority wants to lower the fees as part of presumably influencing and directing growth, because it would only go that way for that reason, wouldn't they?
Because it can't be too much, because the other aspect of it is that you're only allowed to do it for cost recovery. So, they can't be
why
too
would
high.
the government pile in and say, you got to, I don't know, it doesn't make any sense. Maybe there'll be more details.
So those are DM world type things, but there are other stuff. I already mentioned planning policy, strategic planning, infrastructure stuff. Do you want to just touch on that?
On the what? On the which bit? I was reading the next bit, the nature mitigation stuff.
Oh, well, those are the headline things. You could just leave it right there. But if you want to mention another one we haven't said, that's fine.
Well, the nature mitigation stuff is interesting. I think it's interesting because we already do some of it. Now, before we go too further, what the bill facilitates and government has pushed particularly hard is that it seeks to address concerns on environmental regulations, and it touches on issues which we don't have at Wealden. So that's nutrient neutrality, which in lots of councils are considered to be a barrier in stalling housing and infrastructure projects. And to counteract all of this, the government is proposing what's called a nature restoration fund, and that is intended to be financed through developer contributions in relation to the grants of planning permission. So it'd be a standard charge, and ultimately it goes to a strategic mitigation. Now, what you'll see, or listeners will see if you go looking for research around this, is that there is particular concern that might not work, or there's a sort of raised eyebrow that strategic mitigation, how does it apply at the local level? Now, as I said a second ago, we're already doing it, aren't we? And we've been doing it for a while. We've been strategic mitigation for SANGs and SAMs in relation to net increases of residential development within 7 kilometres of the Ashdown Forest, and that's the policy that's and an approach which is, well, when did we start looking at that? 2008-9, and then the policy was 2012, and successive iterations of that. So long established. But more recently, we've rolled out the district level licensing regime in partnership with Natural England and Nature Space and the other district and boroughs within East Sussex. So the long story short on that is it is great crested newt mitigation on a sort of RAG basis for impact zones, where you can pay into a strategic mitigation, and that goes to newt mitigation and creation of new habitat. And it's really very successful. We can leave a link below to some information on the performance of that over the last couple of years, because it's very positive. And it works. So there's nothing I've seen that would indicate that rolling that out for other topics and plugging that strategic mitigation into a habitats regulation assessment would A, be unlawful, and B, not work in terms of the inability to grant development. And government obviously must agree, because they've pushed this provision out in the new bill. Lots of criticism around that. Lots of people, as I say, kind of sniffy about it. One of the things that's interesting is this environmental delivery plan, which is a requirement for Natural England. Yep. And one of the concerns is that Natural England are already under-resourced, they're already stretched, kind of phones ringing in empty offices type thing, and that they're struggling at the moment as a general point. And if they've got this environmental delivery plan obligation, can they do it at the pace that government is expecting? Who knows? We'll have to see.
Indeed, we'll have to see. Well, that's it from us today. Contrary to what you might think about this when you listen to it, we do try to plan what we talk about, and actually there were a whole list of things before we settled on giving you an update about the Old Orchard condition appeal, and also just giving some brief commentary on the planning and infrastructure bill. But just a couple more things from me just to remind you about. Please do take a look at our planning hub. They've got sections on there that explain how planning applications work. Try to put some interesting cases on there. More specifically, I just wanted to remind anybody listening that we do have a Ask the Development Managers function on there. So if you've got any questions about the planning process here at Wealden, then please do ask. And also, we'll put a link to it. Our 5-year housing land supply position statement has been updated this last week or two.
Well, it was local plan subcommittee, wasn't it? And the papers that went with that.
So again, we'll include the link to that. We don't, just as a kind of headline, we still can't demonstrate a 5-year supply of housing, but
I don't think we ever will now with the drainage decision.
Well, yeah, exactly. Numbers change, so we just want to draw your attention to that. As ever, if there's anything that you think that you'd like us to cover, please comment, let us know. But until next time, it's bye from me.
Yeah, bye from me. Thanks very much.